to everyone who's joining today from around Australia. My name is Amanda, and as Hannah said, I'm Manager of Reference and Community Outreach Services here in our Canberra office. So the role of my team is to assist members of the public to access records in the collection, whether that's in person in one of our research centres or facilitating access through our database and through digitisation. As NAA members, I'm sure you already have some knowledge and interest in the National Archives, but today I'm going to go through the types of immigration records we hold, share a few stories, and then I'll give you a brief run through of a record search database. If you have any questions during the presentation, as Hannah said, put them in the chat. I'll do my best to answer them at the end, and anything that I can't answer, we'll be able to follow up at a later date as well. So the National Archives is the archives of the federal government. Our collection consists largely of records created by the Commonwealth Government since Federation in 1901. This means, for example, that we don't have records, we don't generally have records about convicts or early migration of convicts, but we do hold many records relating to 20th century events in your family's history, including immigration, of course, and defence service. We manage more than 40 million records in different formats across Australia. Most of our records are paper files, but we also hold posters, maps, plans, photographs, films, audio tapes, and a growing collection of born digital records as we enter, as more and more of those digital records are entering our collection. Our records document the nation's growth and development and cover almost every topic affecting the lives of Australians. Under the Archives Act, members of the public have a right to access, to apply for access to records over 20 years of age. So we call this the open period. For example, as of the 1st of January this year, records dating up to 2003 became eligible for release. It's useful to keep these dates in mind when doing your research. Sometimes, however, a record in the open period is withheld from public access in whole or in part. This is because they contain information that is personally sensitive or exempt for other reasons, such as national security. We examine all files prior to their release to identify and withhold material that continues to be sensitive. So here you can see a fairly comprehensive, though not complete, surprisingly, list of the type of records held by the National Archives. So you can see there's quite a few there, and yes, that's not a complete list, although that does capture the majority. But today's presentation, of course, is on immigration records, so we'll take a closer look at those. So immigration records in our collection fall into several different categories, including migrant selection documents, passenger records, alien registration records, naturalization records, and more. What types of records each migrant will have depends on factors such as when they migrated, their country of origin, whether or not they came under an assisted passage scheme, and whether they became citizens. People will generally have one or more of the types of files pictured here, depending on their individual circumstances. At bare minimum, there should be a passenger arrival record for every person who migrated to Australia, but in practicality, this is not always the case, as record keeping practices, as you go further back, human error, sometimes things don't survive, but generally we do tend to have at least a passenger arrival record for everyone who came. Now, while my focus today will be mostly on the decades following World War II immigration, I'll first briefly touch on the pre-World War II period. So during this time, the Commonwealth Government's involvement with immigration was generally more related to enforcing law for borders and, unfortunately, keeping people out rather than encouraging mass migration. One of the early acts created following Federation was the Immigration Restriction Act. The Act prohibited entry of those who failed to pass a dictation test of 50 words in a European language. While race was not specifically referred to in the Immigration Restriction Act, the dictation test became a tool with which to exclude non-Europeans and other applicants the government at the time deemed to be undesirable. Here is an example of some of the phrases that were used by the customs officers. So anyone failing to write down the passages perfect grammar, could be deported. And ultimately, the test was designed to be failed. Even if the would-be migrant could speak English perfectly, they could also be tested on little spoken languages such as Scots Gaelic and refused entry as a result. So it was very, very biased. Now, of course, while the Immigration Restriction Act came into place in 1901, there were already a large number of people from non-European backgrounds living in Australia, including around 30,000 Chinese-born people who had migrated to Australia many years earlier during the gold rush. Thus, certificates of exemption from the dictation test were granted on a case-by-case basis. Australian residents re-entering the country who wanted to apply for an exemption from the dictation test had to first demonstrate that they were of good character. Sim Choon, for example, pictured here, had to produce a number of written references in order to re-enter the country he'd been living for many years. One was from a school teacher stating that Sim Choon was a keen businessman and a desirable citizen. Another from a businessman declared him to be a bright, honest, and intelligent lad. A fair portion of the inquiries we receive, particularly here in Canberra, are from people looking for records of their travel to Australia. This is either for family history purposes or increasingly for evidentiary purposes. So passenger records document the movement of people into and out of Australia. The master of each passenger ship and aircraft was required to provide authorities with a list of passengers disembarking and embarking at each port. In terms of accessing passenger lists, it can be quite slightly complicated and varied. The Commonwealth took over responsibility for arrival and departure of passengers in around 1924. So from that point on, the NAA will have in some form records relating to this. Earlier records that we do hold relating to passengers include arrivals to Fremantle from 1898, although these are scattered, and microfilm copies of some earlier passenger arrivals for ports dating back to the 1950s. But it is important to note that pre-Federation passenger record holdings are very limited in our collection, as we are the Commonwealth Government. And most arrivals for the 1800s and before are held by the various state archives rather than the NAA. There's no master index of passenger arrivals that covers all locations and periods. However, for the period 1924 to 1972, we do have an excellent passenger index, which I'll show you during our record search demo at the end. For arrival records between 1973 and 1989, these are not able to be viewed on our database. So for those, you would need to log an inquiry with us to conduct a search on your behalf. As you can see from the picture, passenger lists generally only recorded basic information such as name, age, place of departure. Sometimes they would have nationality, occupation, or intended address in Australia, if you're lucky. So while they don't contain a great deal of information, many families find them to be a nice memento of their move to Australia. The details on the lists or cards also sometimes act as a breadcrumb trail for finding other types of records. So knowing when someone came can set you up to look for other types of records. Passenger cards, rather than lists, began later, and they tend to have a little more information than the lists. Some ships also had nominal roll files, which had a little bit more detail in them as well. So files or nominal rolls of passenger ships to Australia can sometimes contain brief stories and even deaths. So this is a bit of a sad snippet from one such file reading, "Only one sad event happened to mar the happiness of the voyage. Miss Mary Craig, one of our girls from Ireland, after partaking of a hearty meal, went on deck, commenced skipping, fell through overexertion, collapsed and died within an hour. One of our boys was left behind for hospital treatment at Cape Town. We have no news, so conclude that he's making a good recovery." So here we have an example of an incoming passenger card for a migrant named, I always pronounce this incorrectly, but Voitra, I believe, Marek, who migrated to Australia in 1948. And like many migrants who have come to Australia, Voitra has quite an interesting story. He met his wife Vera university during the Second World War. He was a skilled artist, but in February 1948, everything changed when he was told that if he didn't join the Communist Party, he would never be able to exhibit his artworks. It was then that they made the decision to leave Czechoslovakia. Wojciech's younger brother, Dusan, also wanted to leave, so they arranged with a cousin who was part of the underground movement to cross the border into Germany. After arriving into a camp in Germany and not having the bartering skills that other Czechs possessed, Wojciech began making a bust for an American commander. He would travel to the commander's quarters once a week. His progress payments consisted of just 2 peanut butter sandwiches for his time and for his work. They later travelled to Australia on board the SS Charlton Sovereign. The ship ran into many problems on the journey to Australia, taking 3 months to arrive, after stopping in Gibraltar and Jakarta. After arriving in Australia, Wojciech, Vera and Dusan decided to make Adelaide their home, taking jobs on the railway to start their new lives over. After working a range of jobs, including as a jeweller, lighthouse keeper and a welder, he decided it was time to concentrate solely on the reason he had left his home country, his artwork. So with many new churches being built following the influx of migrants to Australia, he secured numerous commissions for religious artworks and statues, as well as furnishings, chalices, and more. He sadly suffered an accident in the 1970s that meant he was forced to retire. However, his employees carried on production of his existing designs. He and his wife made 2 trips back to Europe in the following years, with Wojciech passing away in 1999. Another type of record we hold are migrant selection documents. Now, the Second World War, and especially the war in the Pacific, had raised concerns relating to Australia's vulnerability to invasion. There was also a critical shortage of labour to meet the demands of a post-war reconstruction of the economy. Arthur Calwell, the first Minister for Immigration, declared, and you've probably all heard this one, that Australia must populate or perish. The Department of Immigration was formally established in 1945 to plan, manage, and implement an ambitious program of immigration to meet this need. Applicants were attracted by offers of assisted passage and accommodation for sponsored migrants. Between 1947 and 1983, nearly 3 million people migrated to Australia, over 1/3 from the United Kingdom. So migrant selection documents were completed by the applicant and returned to the Chief Migration Officer in the capital of the country in which the applicant was living. These documents were then forwarded to the State Office of the Department of Immigration in the state that the migrant intended to settle. Personal information in migrant selection documents usually consists of migrant's name, nationality, date and place of birth, spouse and children, and employment details. Many also included small photographs. On some documents, names of next of kin or parents are included, though this isn't always the case. Other information available in migrant selection documents usually concerns travel and accommodation arrangements and medical reports. These documents are a useful bridge in giving us an insight into a person's details, life, and motivations as they move towards their new life in Australia. Most migrant selection documents for post-war migration schemes are listed at item level and can be searched in our database. However, the full files are generally only digitised or scanned when people pay to have that done. Now, I'm just going to cough. I'm so sorry. I'm just going to mute my mic. Forgive me. Okay. Now, in the first few years of the Department of Immigration's existence, the priority was to maintain a focus on Britain as the primary source for immigrants. In spite of this preference, the number of British people wanting to migrate to Australia fell far short of the numbers needed to fill the quota set for the migration program. Simply put, it was time to cast the net wider. At the end of World War II, there were around 1 million refugees from occupied countries in Eastern and Central Europe who were not able to return to their country. In 1947, Calwell visited Europe to arrange shipping for migrants from Britain, and at that time he also met the International Refugee Organisation and agreed to consider immigration to Australia from the displaced person camps in Europe. Calwell spoke of the splendid human capital in the camps as a ready labour pool and was keen for the department to secure displaced persons or refugees for migration to Australia. In July 1947, the Australian government signed an agreement with the IRO to arrange transport, accommodation, and employment for 4,000 displaced persons. Applicants were required to sign work contracts and have the capacity to work as labourers to be accepted for immigration. There was also a particular interest in taking family groups, and officials tended to favour families with large numbers of children. In November 1947, the first ship carrying called the General Hatzelman reached Fremantle carrying 843 migrants, Latvians, Lithuanians and Estonians. The number of people eventually immigrating to Australia under the Displaced Persons Scheme far exceeded the original yearly quota envisioned by Cornwall. Between 1947 and 1954, more than 170,000 displaced persons arrived in Australia, so quite a bit of a difference from what they originally estimated. This was the largest number of non-British migrants in that time frame in the history of Australian migration. In exchange for the travel, displaced persons agreed to work for a period of between 1 to 2 years wherever the government directed. Many were sent to rural towns where there was a particular skills shortage due to World War II. This also helped public attitudes and sentiment towards the new arrivals. So the government also administered and implemented a number of programs providing a range of services to immigrants that would assist them in their sea journey and their settlement in Australia when they arrived. English language teaching was a key focus, and the department also worked closely with other areas of government to provide accommodation and employment to new migrants. Migrant hostels were a key part of this early support structure. One of the biggest migrant centres was Bonegilla. Many of the displaced persons who came to Australia in the immediate post-war period lived at Bonegilla for their first weeks or months in the country. They learned to speak English and adapt to life in Australia at the centre before being moved to areas to find employment. The National Archives has extensive holdings of Bonegilla cards in custody, which have been indexed and digitised and are available to view on our record search database. Unfortunately, while there were a number of other migrant centres around Australia, few individual records of the other centres have survived to be archived with us. Though we do have some other, quite a few administration and policy files for the other centres, as well as some photographs. In the bottom left photo, you can see children collecting their milk in the Wakol immigrants holding camp, which was purposely built in 1947 to receive non-British post-war immigrants from war-torn Europe. It's worth noting that the only information these migrants had about Australia prior to their arrival here was a government-issued pamphlet. It's difficult to imagine just how daunting that must have been for them. And here we have quite a famous Aussie who spent some time at Bonegilla, so you probably recognise him, Dr. Carl. Dr. Carl came to Australia as a 2-year-old with his parents Ludwig and Rena in 1950. Before the war, Ludwig, Carl's father, had been a journalist in a city under Polish control. When the city was occupied by the Russians in 1939, he was arrested by Soviet secret police and sent to prison. He managed to escape from the prison 2 years later in 1941 on the first day of fighting between the Germans and the Russians, only to be later captured and imprisoned in a number of German concentration camps. At the end of the war, his home was under Soviet control, and Ludwig was transferred from Germany to a displaced persons camp in Sweden by the Red Cross, as he feared that if he returned to his former home, he would be persecuted. Dr. Karl's mother, Rena, was 17 when her home city in Poland was occupied by German forces in 1939. Rena was Jewish and sent to a place in central Poland where she was to spend, Lodzghetto in central Poland, where she was to spend 5 years. When the Germans shut down the ghetto in 1944, its occupants, including Rena, were sent to German concentration camps. She spent the rest of the war in various concentration camps where she was lucky to survive, though she sadly lost her brother and sister during this time. Like Ludwig, Rena was sent to Sweden after the war, where she learned millinery and studied English, and that's where she met her English teacher, Ludwig. Rena turned down the opportunity to study millinery further at the House of Dior in Paris, instead marrying Ludwig in November 1946. Their son Carl was born 2 years later. For years, Carl thought that his mother was born in Sweden. It was only years later that she told him her story. Interestingly, the Krushelnitskys, I hope I pronounced that right, Carl's family, their application for resettlement shows that they actually wanted to live in America initially. So Australia nearly missed out on Dr. Carl. But in a twist of fate, while they were waiting for the ship to arrive, little Carl had a reaction to the smallpox vaccine. His parents were worried and they chose not to take the ship when it arrived. The next available ship was going to Australia. So in November 1950, the family arrived in Sydney on the MS Goya. They stayed in Bonegilla for a short time before settling in Wollongong. Carl says one of the few memories he has of the camp was that they were allowed one egg each per week, and that his parents gave him theirs. It's also unlikely that Carl's father, Ludwig, needed the English lessons provided at Bonegilla, as he of course already spoke English, as well as Polish, German, Spanish, Swedish, and Ukrainian, just to name a few. In the early 1950s, the department continued to manage a number of assisted immigration schemes designed to encourage migration from more than 30 European countries. Over a 4-year period, Australia entered into agreements with Italy and the Netherlands in 1951, Austria, Belgium, Greece, Spain, and West Germany in 1952, and Denmark, Finland, Norway, Sweden, and Switzerland, and the US in 1954. These pictures show a 1950s migration program in action as workers from Italy migrated to fill severe labour shortages in industries such as sugarcane in North Queensland. Some of the young cane cutters who arrived on the Flaminia in 1955 are shown in the top left, and next to that are some disembarking from the Aurelia in 1956. Both of these ships were bound for Cairns. The bottom images show welcomes being given to the new arrivals and customs officers checking luggage. Sadly, as we well know, even once they had settled in Australia, things did not always run smoothly for those who migrated. The threat posed by the world wars during the 20th century twice caused the Australian government to require all aliens, i.e. non-British subjects and foreign nationals living in Australia, to register with local authorities. Registration was required between 1916 and 1926, and then again between 1939 and 1971. Conditions of alien registration changed throughout the century, but obviously increased around the World War II period, when the individuals had to report every house move, change of job, marriage, or change of name. Some were even interned in camps. Individuals were required to carry around alien registration cards with them, a copy of which you'll see here. We have hundreds of thousands of alien registration records in custody across a number of our offices, many of which can be searched on our database. Now, as I mentioned in the last slide, sometimes those who are registered as aliens were sometimes interned. So the next type of records I'll mention are internment records. Internees were mostly people from countries at war with Australia. Most were civilian men, but some women and children were also interned. Internees were held at camps around Australia, often in remote locations. It's important to note that the people who were interned based solely on the nationality, even if they'd done no wrong. In terms of internment records, we hold records in our collection about immigration camps, camp development and administration, government policy on internment, and we also have records of the people who spent their war years in internment. These records are not complete. They can sometimes be difficult to locate in our database. So if you believe someone may have one and you need assistance locating it, you can lodge an inquiry with us and we can assist. Another popular collection of records relevant to family history is naturalization records. Now, most of you may know what it means, but just in case, naturalization simply means becoming a citizen. At Federation in 1901, British subject was the sole civic status noted in the Australian Constitution. The Australasian Federal Convention of 1897 was unable to agree on a definition of the term citizen and wanted to preserve British nationality in Australia. An administrative concept of citizenship arose from the need to distinguish between British subjects who were permanent residents here and those who were simply visitors. The concept was formalised in the Nationality and Citizenship Act 1948, which created the status of Australian citizen. The first citizenship ceremony was held at Albert Hall in Canberra in 1949, so just a stone's throw from where I am at the moment. Before 1952, less than half of all migrants had declared an intention to become naturalised, and of those who declared an intention to do so, less than 25% of those actually followed through. The process of naturalisation was onerous, including long waiting periods and a complicated and time-consuming application procedure. The Nationality and Citizenship Act 1955 included measures that simplified this process. As a consequence of these changes, the number of naturalizations jumped from 5,000 in 1954 to more than 49,000 naturalizations in 1959. Throughout the 1960s, Australian citizens were still required to declare the nationality as British. The term Australian nationality had no official recognition or meaning until the Act was amended in 1969 and renamed the Citizenship Act. This followed a growing sense of Australian nationalism and sense of declining importance of the British Empire for Australians. In 1973, the Act was renamed the Australian Citizenship Act, but it was not until 1984 that Australian citizens ceased to be British subjects. All of this means that because many migrants were British, there was little need or motivation to become citizens. So this is another reason you may find less records around naturalisation relating to British migrants for most of this period. It's also one of the reasons that we get a lot of inquiries from people who are looking for their naturalisation records because they came with their families as a child, only to find out that they aren't actually citizens. In terms of our holdings, we hold naturalisation records for the colony of South Australia and Victoria from the 1850s, so that's another one of our little pre-Federation anomalies, and for all Australian states from 1904. Records of other colonies prior to Federation are held by the various state archives. Naturalisation records take two forms. So there's the naturalisation files, which basically contain all the paperwork surrounding a person's application to be naturalised. These files can contain a lot of useful information such as personal details, places of residence, family members, dates of arrival in Australia. And then there's also naturalisation certificates. So we hold duplicates of naturalisation certificates up to the end of 1961, which is when the Department of Immigration stopped making duplicate copies. So we can't provide any certificates after that date. Here you can see some images of a naturalisation certificate, as well as some photographs from the first ceremony at Albert Hall. The last thing I want to mention is our photographs. So the archives holds a wealth of photographs that may be of interest to your family history. Among the most popular are the Immigration Photographic Archive, Series A12111, which comprises of around 36,000 photographs taken by photographers employed to record the arrival and resettlement of migrants post-war and their integration into the Australian community. We also have a huge number of photographs by the Australian Overseas Information Service, who are government photographers who travel to all parts of Australia to take photographs of everyday Australian life. They include subjects such as people, places, events, festivals, fauna, flora, health, agriculture, and industry. So they're very varied. These photographs and more can be searched using our photo search and record search databases, which I'll show you in a few moments. Now, before I go into our live demo, I'll quickly mention that only around 44% of our collection is described on the database at item level. So immigration records tend to be much better described than others. So that 44% applies to everything in our collection, not just immigration records. Immigration records tend to be higher use, so that percentage is higher, but it's still important to remember that not everything's listed on our database, particularly when you're dealing with things like passenger records for the 70s and 80s, or migrant case files from the 80s onwards. Many of those won't be on our database, so you may need to submit a request for us to do a search. We don't do detailed research on people's behalf, but we do searches and where we need to, and where something isn't on the database, and we can also point you in the right direction if you need assistance. For submitting inquiry online, you first go to our, so you can see in the screenshot there, you first go to our homepage and then to the Help with Your Research tab at the top of the screen, and then click on Ask Us About the Collection. That will take you into a list of online forms. You can then choose the topic that best suits your question. So you can see there's immigration records form, passenger arrival records form, departure. There's a lot of other topics, and if you can't find the one you're looking for, there's also a general inquiry form. You fill that one in online and submit it, and you generally receive a response from either my team or one of the other teams around Australia within 30 business days. So I'll now give you a quick run through of a record search database, and after that I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have put in the chat. Now you'll have to bear with me because it's a little bit of I've got to switch over screens, so hopefully it'll play the game for me. Oops, hold up. So hopefully that's going to work here. All right, Hannah, you'll have to let me know if you can see that.
Yep, you are doing it perfectly. All good.
Fantastic, excellent. Okay, so this is our website. Most of you, I imagine, have seen it if you've joined up to become members. So we're going to go into record search. Now, this can be accessed either from our main homepage here. So we've got a button, or we can go through explore the collection and then record search. So I might just go through that one for now. Now, I'm hoping you can still see the next screen. I'm sure.
Yep.
Yep. So now if you can't,
all
great.
Good.
Fantastic. All right. Okay, so we've opened to our basic search screen. So in this screen, we can do a search for, this is where you can do a search for keywords or name. We can also narrow it by date range if we want to. But I always recommend when you're doing sort of family history research or search for immigration records, it's best to leave the date range blank unless the name's very common. The reason for that is sometimes records are not in the date range that you expect, and you don't want to unnecessarily narrow your results. We can always refine our results to a different date range later. So I'm going to do just a test one to show you. So we're going to type in a name. We're going to leave the date range blank for now, and I'm going to click on search. So we can see that it's brought up a list of 6 items with that name in the title. And quite unusually, this is not generally the case, but all of these files are digitized. So there's a few, in terms of interpreting what we see here, there's a few different headings to be aware of. So the series number, the series heading here, that one is, a series is essentially a group of files or a type of file. So you can, so you can get a little bit, once you've become more experienced, you can get a bit knowledgeable about what particular series look familiar. There's a control symbol, which is unique to that file, item title, and a date range. We also have our one here that shows us that there is a digital copy for each of these records. So if I go into one of these ones here, so we can see that this file has been digitized. There's only 2 pages in this particular record. So if we wanted to go back and forth, we can go forward to our next page. And we can see all of the details here. Now, if I had a larger file, or if I wanted to save this file to my computer, and I always tell people this one because a lot of people aren't aware of it, you can actually export a PDF and save it or print it by clicking on that button. So you don't need to go through the rigmarole of trying to print out the pictures that you see here. You can actually save it as a PDF. Close that one. Now I'm going to go back to our basic search again for a moment because we were very lucky for that search. All the items relating to that person, all the items related to the person we were looking for, and all of them were digitized. Now that may be the case if you're dealing with an uncommon name. I've seen people, they type in a name, and because they're one of the only ones in Australia with that surname, that everything relates to their family. But if you're dealing with a more common name, you may need to do things a little differently. So say I know that relatives came to Australia in the 1960s, and I know that the father's name was Harry Potter. I am going to type in Harry Potter. Now, this is just one of the ways we can do this search, but I'm just showing you the basic search screen at the moment. And given that I feel like Potter might be a fairly common surname, I am going to put a broad date range in this time. Now, even though I know he arrived sometime in the 60s, even if I know it was 65, I'm still going to keep things pretty broad. And I'm going to go with 1960 to 1970. So that's just going to capture any unexpected things, or if they were naturalized a few years later, it may capture that kind of thing. Okay, so this gives us 14 results, and we can scroll through these ones as there aren't too many. But if I had a much longer list here, I could actually sort these results. And I'll show you how to do that. So those headings that we looked at earlier, we can actually sort by clicking those ones. So if I wanted to put all the similar types of records together, I could click on series. Now that's going to put photos first. Then we've got some other things here. Puts the same type of files together. I could also sort by control symbol, though that's not particularly handy if you're new. I can sort by alphabetical order. And that can be very useful if you're searching for a particular name. Or I can also search by date range. So that's going to put the earliest first. And then I can scroll past the stuff that's not particularly relevant to me. So say we're looking through this one, and there it is, the person that I'm looking for. Now you'll see that this particular file is not only not digitized, so we can, if I go back here, we can see, unlike those other ones we saw, there's no digital copy here, so I can't view the actual file online. And it's also, if we look at here, the access status, it's not yet examined. Now, that means that the file has not been through that compulsory examination process I mentioned earlier. And so if I wanted to submit an access application, there are more detailed instructions, but essentially I would need to register and then go through the request copy process to submit an application for access first. Okay. Now, we also have an advanced request search screen, which you can see up here, but I'm not going to go into that one today. It's very detailed, and we are limited on time. But there's information on our website about that one. There's also a lot of useful information about all of our search screens in our little help section up here. But what I will show you next is the name search screen. Now, when you're just starting out your searches or have an unusual name, as I mentioned, you're probably best off going basic search, just so you're not limiting your results unnecessarily. But if you know what type of record you're looking for, or if you have a very common name like Smith, you may want to use the name search screen. It's a good option. So I'm going to look for as an example, I'm going to look for a naturalization record for a Peter Smith. Let's say I've seen some other records, and I think based on that, I think he was naturalized in the early 1900s sometime. So I'm going to type in Smith, type in Peter. I'm going to select from my drop down here. Now it's got lots of different categories of records. And I'm going to click on immigration and naturalization records. And given how common his name is, I'm also going to put in a broad date range. So I'm going to go, I'm going to go 1900 to 1920. So if I say, okay, I think he was naturalized around then. So I could do a search for that. It's a bit slow today. There we go. So we can see it's actually not unusual that these ones are digitized, because all of the early naturalization records, a lot of them are. So if I then wanted to, you can see a lot of the titling can be quite vague. It doesn't have dates of birth and things. So I would need to go through and have a look at the digital copies until I found the person that I was looking for. So there is a lot of sleuthing in that sort of thing, because archival titles can be quite vague. It's also, what I also will show you, if you, for example, if it didn't have naturalization in the title and you wanted to know what type of record this was, so say you did a search and it just said Peter Smith and you're like, okay, well, I have no idea what type of record that is, and this one wasn't digitized. You could click on that, click on our series number, and that's usually going to tell us what type of files they are. So this one says correspondence files, but we can see what agencies created them. Another example, I might show you a better one. If we go back to our Harry Potter example from earlier, we go into that one again. So we go into our item and then into our series number. This is going to tell us that this type of file is a migrant selection document for British migrants. So that could be useful if you're dealing with a list of items for a particular person. You have no idea what each one is, particularly if they're not digitized. So now I'm going to show you our passenger arrival index, which I mentioned earlier. So the index is a great resource, especially when you're starting out your research, because knowing when someone arrived can be the piece of the puzzle that you need to connect to other pieces of your family history. So for this search screen, you can put in what information you have, even if it's just a name. So the other fields are optional. Let's say I'm looking for a man named with Fred Jones. So I'm looking for a man named Fred Jones. Now, that gives us a list there. We can also sort, we can see that lists the person's name, date of arrival. It lists the ship name and where they came from as well. And we can also sort these by the same way we did before. We could sort them by name, we could sort them by date of arrival. So that puts the earliest first. And then over here, you can see that these images actually link you directly to the passenger record in question. Whereas clicking on these ones will actually take you to the whole box that the cards are held in. So I recommend clicking on these over that. Now, if you don't find the person that you're looking for straight away, and this tip applies to basic search and name search screens as well, you may need to do searches under some name variations until you find it. So even though you might have known somebody as Fred his whole life, he may have actually been formerly known as Frederick. So you may need to do a search under Frederick, or even just an initial. So sometimes the initials don't work so well on the other screens, but see if it works on this one. If I just do F Jones, it's going to give us a very long list. But see, you can see some people arrived just under their first initial. So if you're having trouble finding somebody, that may be why. It's important to think outside the box as well. If you can't find a particular person, no matter what you try, if you know that they travelled with somebody, you could also try searching for another member of their family. So we often find people that way. If they have a difficult to spell name, we might pick one of their other family members, find that person, and then we can find the whole family. So that just thinking outside the box and running different searches to cover all bases. And of course, if you can't find what you're looking for, you are welcome to reach out to us by putting in an inquiry. And lastly, this is our photo search database. So this one can be a fun one to play around with. You can type in a keyword of pretty much anything you like. So place, person, ship, anything, and get some wonderful photographs from our collection. So I will, as an example, I'll type in one of the ships that I mentioned in my presentation, so the Aurelia. So that brings up over 100 photographs relating to that ship. So of course, they're not all relating to that ship. We've got some of the ship themselves, but then we've also got people who came on that ship as well. Now you see in the titles, they won't necessarily, some of them will mention names, some won't mention names. So it is worth having a bit of a look at the photo search database. It may turn up photographs that wouldn't necessarily appear on a person's migration files. You could also, if you're bored on a Friday afternoon at work, you can also just type in fun things. I'm a big fan of frogs, so you can just type in any keyword you like, and you can get some rather horrific, but also some fantastic gems. So yeah, it's a great one to play around with, even if you don't necessarily find a photograph that relates to your family.